have some bad news, everyone. A lot of what I told you in previous videos was wrong. Well, they weren't wrong when I made the videos, but they are now. But I guess most of them aren't actually wrong. It's more that they're outdated and there are better or easier ways to do things now that either I didn't know about yet or I couldn't tell you about because the features didn't exist. But listen, it was unavoidable. I didn't know how much Blender would change. I mean, when I started using Blender in 2019, it looked like this. Now Blender updates and adds new features multiple times a year. So let's take a look at what has changed and I'll show some new ways of doing things. Let's check out some that aren't related to geometry nodes first, since most of these are gonna be about geometry nodes. A feature that I missed in a ton of my old videos is about the Alt button. If you ever want to change the same value for multiple objects, holding the Alt button will usually let you do that. Like these two cubes both have a bevel modifier, and if they're both selected and I adjust this slider while holding Alt, it will change for both of them. And this works all over the place, even in the node editors. Like, you can change multiple noise textures at the same time this way. In some of my old rigging videos, I told people to get a bulk renaming add-on to rename multiple bones at the same time, but you can actually do that without an add-on by pressing Ctrl F2. It works for a bunch of data types like bones, lights, materials, nodes, and it lets you do things like find and replace for removing 001 from all of the names, or you can add suffixes. Very useful. In some of my old shader nodes videos, I used this noise distortion trick to make things look a little messier, and for some reason, I always did it using the factor output. Now, I always use the color output. Using the factor does work, but the problem you get from this is that you're using the same values for each axis, and if you turn it up high enough, you can tell it kind of smears diagonally. You don't get this issue when you use the color, because each axis gets a slightly different texture. I use this trick all the time in geometry nodes too, by the way. Speaking of geometry nodes, the first video I made using them is completely defunct now. When they first came out, they used a whole different workflow all about making and editing attributes, but they reworked it to use fields, which is what we have now. Once I got comfortable with geometry nodes, I used them to replace a lot of the modifier-based effects from my old videos. They all heavily relied on the displacement modifier, which still works fine, but you're limited to the textures in this tab over here. Nowadays, I do all of this with geonodes using a set position node, which gives you a lot more control because you can more easily mix textures and control multiple nodes with the same values, instead of adding 3 different displacement modifiers and hopping back and forth between them to dial in the values. So like I said, these landscapes could be made with a set position node and a noise texture affecting the z-axis. You can decide where everything is placed with weight painting, and you can bring that in with a named attribute node. This one is just a bunch of curves being displaced with a set position node again. And you can mask the edges out by finding the distance to an empty. This video about face scaling is way easier now thanks to the scale element node and the extrude node. Add the icosphere, split the edges, and use a scale elements node. Then you can plug a texture into the scale. Instead of the solidify modifier, you can use the extrude node to get the same effect in this case. Honestly, a lot of the outdated stuff from old videos is because new nodes keep being added that replace modifiers, which is nice because we get the option to use either. I'm hoping we get more modifier functionality like beveling and decimating. Being able to control those with textures would be wild. In this video, I talk a lot about attributes, and everything still applies except for one crucial part. The transfer attribute node doesn't exist anymore. Instead of that, you have to use the sample index node with the sample nearest node. It works the same, but it was split into multiple nodes. So yes, I do know about this, and you can stop commenting about it, or at least look at the pinned comment first. I used this huge setup to get this effect of bundled cables, and now it can be done way easier with the duplicate elements node. Just use it to duplicate your spline, and when you go to displace it with a noise texture, use the duplicate index to change the W value. And that's pretty much it. It's a tiny setup now. In this one, I show how to smooth out meshes, and again, I used this huge setup, but now it's as easy as using these nodes right here. It's way faster and easier, so definitely don't use the old setup. Plus, the blur attribute can be used for some other awesome things, like in this video by Arendelle. When I made this ASCII art filter, I had to render out all of the characters I wanted to use to make a sprite sheet, and it worked fine, but geometry nodes makes it way easier and more customizable. It's the same idea where how light or dark the image is determines what characters to place, but with geometry nodes, you can use the string to curves node and swap out the characters on the fly or even change the font. This is the setup, and the gist of it is that I'm instancing onto a grid of points. What I'm placing on the points comes from this string to curves node, and by default it treats each character like an individual object, and we can choose the character with this index socket. But instead of choosing it manually, I'm using the value from an image or video, and it should work as long as you multiply the value of the image by how many characters you're using. I actually have a few effect filters that I made, like the glitch effect, paint filter, and this pixel sorting style filter, where I tried to use the shader editor, kind of like a compositor for post effects to use with already rendered videos. And now with the Realtime compositor, these could be made much more conveniently because you can see the effect while you're working on your scene, and you only have to render it once. It might be a while though before this replaces my effects, since the compositor is still missing some things like procedural textures. Until then, we have to use video clips instead, but it is getting closer. For example, here is a CRT screen effect that I've been working on using the Realtime compositor. As for my paint filter video, Alan Wyatt has made an incredible and much better paint filter using geometry nodes. Alan is a traditional artist also, and you can totally tell because it looks very close to the real thing. There's a link for this in the description. My recursive subdivision video is built around the idea of making a node group and then duplicating it a bunch of times, and we don't have to do that anymore because in Blender 4.0 we get repeat nodes. Basically, anything inside this zone will be repeated as many times as you specify, which would make a lot of things easier, like putting branches onto other branches, like in my lightning video, or you could make a plexus effect, or extrude something a bunch of times. My fuzz video was quickly toppled by the hair nodes introduced in geometry nodes. The way I did it before was by making a few hair shapes and then scattering them all over the model. Now you can select a model, press Shift A, and under curve we have this fur option, and that's all you need to make something fuzzy. To get the shape closer to my old result, I added a curl hair curves modifier before this interpolate one. You can find all these pre-made groups in the asset browser, and you can just drag and drop them onto an object in your scene. Anyway, with the curl node, I just increased the frequency to make it spiral more, made the radius smaller, and added a few subdivisions. You can turn up this number in the interpolate group to add more hair. And if you want the color to be inherited from the mesh, you can put this node setup at the end to copy the UV map from your object. Then in the shader editor, you can use the image responsible for the color and use an attribute node to give it the right UV map. This still only works with images, so if you're using procedural materials, then you'll have to bake them unless you want to make the node setup way more complicated. And to make baking easy, I've been using a free add-on called BakeLab. Now that simulation nodes are a thing, what I showed in these next videos is much easier to do. Like in my moving points video, there was a problem with the points occasionally teleporting really far away, but if you use this node setup with simulation nodes, then the result is much smoother and you only need a few nodes. In the sparkle video and the one about fire, I had to use the index node to make instances look like they're appearing over time, but with simulation nodes we can skip a lot of steps and use this setup to actually add points over time instead of faking it. And if you want to delete them after a while so they don't pile up, then you can track how old they are. You can do this with a store named attribute node. I'll name it age, then get a named attribute node also called age, add 1 to it, and feed it into itself. For every frame that passes, the nodes in the simulation zone will repeat. So every frame, this age value will increase by 1 and add that attribute to the points as they spawn in. You can then use a delete node to delete points that are a certain age. So this right here is deleting points that have been around for more than 90 frames. That's the gist of how you would make a similar effect, but you can do all sorts of things with age, like scaling instances over time or changing color. The simulation nodes have a ton of potential, and if you want to learn more, check out this video on my second channel where I show all the things I've learned how to do with them so far. You can also check out the Mastering Simulation Nodes course by Arendelle to learn about things like voids and erosion. Links for everything will be in the description. So, is it a big deal knowing that a lot of the Blender videos you'll see might be outdated within a few months? I don't really think it's a big deal. I'd say that if the video is about geometry nodes, then try to find something recent, but even old videos will help you learn concepts. If the video isn't about geometry nodes, then you could probably watch something from like 3 years ago and still follow along without any issues. Just look for something from Blender 2.8 or newer. With that being said, what are some of the ways to stay aware of new features? Well, you can hear about new Blender versions by using a launcher like the .bow launcher. It tells you when new versions are released and lets you install multiple versions at once, including experimental branches. For new features, I like to check release notes on blender.org for an overview of what has been added, and they do a good job at making these pages engaging and clearly illustrating new features. For even more detail though, you can check release notes on the Blender wiki. I like to check this to see what's being added to alpha and beta versions. And if you don't like any of these options, you can always follow people on YouTube. There are always people making videos about new things being added, so a quick search should get you some good content. If you're the type of person that learns best when someone walks through things step by step, then check out my new second channel where I do exactly that. It's much more casual, where I do a lot of project-based videos and building things from scratch. As always, you can get the project files from my videos over on Patreon. Thanks for watching and have a good one.